So if you're watching this video, you probably already know that in 1974, Ahmadis were declared non-Muslims in Pakistan. Now, we know that this happened in the 1974 assembly, and we first of all need to see that when an assembly takes place, or when a court hearing takes place, then the judge or the person presiding the assembly has to be unbiased and has to have no affiliation whatsoever with either of the parties so that it can be held with justice. But what we can see in the report of the 1974 assembly is that before the assembly even began, the scholars, the clerics and the assembly had decided that if the Ahmadis say something which might be ambiguous, or if there is an important matter which the assembly sees to which they cannot answer at that moment, then the Ahmadis will be asked to leave. At that time, the scholars and the assembly will discuss that matter between themselves, even though it's supposed to be an unbiased conversation. Then the Ahmadis will be called back, then they will be asked to defend themselves. We can see that this means that before the assembly had even begun, the scholars, the assembly, the clerics had decided to, in an unbiased manner, present their views against the Ahmadis together, where this should have never happened in the first place. Secondly, we need to take a look at the fact that the assembly was formed to decide whether Ahmadis are Muslims or non-Muslims. Well, it's actually quite ironic, because the three parties which were part of the assembly, Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Islam, Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Pakistan and Jamaat-e-Islami, ironically were already calling each other non-Muslims before the assembly. So why were they put in a position to decide whether someone else is a Muslim when they can't even figure out amongst themselves who is a Muslim? We can see that there were actually three parties involved in this assembly, and the first one was Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Islam, the leader of which was Mufti Mahmud Sahib. He was a Deobandi. Now, there is actually an edict published against Deobandis by 300 scholars in which they state that Deobandis are apostates, that they're kafirs, that they have reached an extreme level in their apostasy and kufr, to the extent that if somebody even doubts that they are kafir or apostate, that person is themselves a kafir and apostate. How ridiculous is that? We can then see that Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Pakistan, whose leader was Shah Ahmad Nurani Sahib, who was a Barelvi, it is said that Sayyid Muhammad Murtaza Sahib said that Ahmad Raza Khan Sahib is not only a kafir, not only an apostate, but he is also a Dajjal. So of course you can see that these parties, who were actually announced to declare whether Ahmadis are Muslims or non-Muslims, were themselves calling one another kafirs and apostates. So the question really is, if they could not themselves decide who is a Muslim among themselves, why were they given the authority to decide whether someone else, specifically Ahmadis, are Muslims or not? To find out more about this topic, make sure to watch part 2 of this series of videos.